My presentation is on, can we trust the Bible? Now, this is an important apologetic issue because if we cannot trust the Bible, then we have fundamental issues about what we know about Christianity, about what we know about the life of Jesus, about our faith as a whole. It becomes hard to determine what Christians should believe if we can't trust the Bible. If you could disprove the Bible, then the foundations of Christian thinking, ethics, and theology begin to crumble. What's more, most specifically, if you can disprove the Gospels, and even most specifically the resurrection, you can disprove the resurrection, then you have fundamentally disproven Christianity. The Apostle Paul even admitted that. He even said, if Christ is not risen from the dead, then we are of all people most to be pitied. So whether or not the Bible is trustworthy is foundational to Christianity. So the questions typically take one of a few different forms. Now, some of them are along the lines of whether or not we can trust the Bible. Some of them are more specifically, can we really take the Bible literally? Can we take it as trustworthy in a historical manner? So to start, we need to understand that not all of the Bible is meant to be taken literally. So two quick examples that I give are Ezekiel 34:23 and John chapter 3. So in Ezekiel 34:23, the prophet Ezekiel mentions that God promises to the people, I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David. He will feed them and be their shepherd. Now, given that Ezekiel was written about 300 years after the death of King David, it clearly can't be literally talking about King David. However, this could be giving us a message, a prophetic message about the shepherd, the Messiah, to come. Now, in this, Ezekiel 34:23 is not telling us that literally David is going to come back and literally be a shepherd, but it's telling us the idea that the future coming Messiah, from Ezekiel's perspective, is going to be one who cares for the people the way a shepherd cares for his flock. It's meant to portray, it's meant to convey images of, in the same way that Israel experienced a prosperity and experienced some of their best of times under King David, there is a great spiritual prosperity to come under this shepherd Messiah prophesied in Ezekiel 34. Again, that's not meant to be read literally. It's meant to be read as a spiritual prophecy about the Messiah to come. John chapter 3 shows an encounter between Jesus and Nicodemus, in which Nicodemus questions some of the ideas that Jesus tells him. And in this, Jesus uses this phrase that we must be born again in order to see heaven. And Nicodemus even didn't understand this when he first heard it. Nicodemus heard this phrase born again and asked, how can I be born again when I am old? But Jesus wasn't talking about being literally and physically born again, but rather this is about a spiritual rebirth found in him. This is about becoming a new creation. So we need to understand not every part of the Bible is meant to be read literally. Rebecca McLaughlin gives an excellent analogy when she says, trying to read every part of the Bible literally, when not all of it's meant to be read that way, it is akin to taking a love poem and going to the grocery store and being confused as to why you can't find all the items on your list. Well, of course you can't, because a poem about love is not meant to be read as anything literal. It's often meant to be read poetically. It's meant to be read metaphorically. And so we need to understand parts of the Bible must be read this way. The Bible contains 66 books, and from various genres and various different angles, various different audiences that it's written to. It wasn't written in a vacuum. It was written over a span of near 2,000 years, and as such, you have varied writings and you have various genres. So you need to understand not every genre is meant to be read literally. Poetry is meant to be read much more poetically, whereas there are several points of history that are recorded in the Bible, and those obviously are meant to be read more literally. I would advocate that the Gospels are meant to be read as history. Now we'll touch on that more in a minute. One of the other concerns that people raise about the Gospels, Bart Ehrman is a big proponent of this question about there are four different pictures, four ununified pictures of Jesus painted in the Gospels. Now, I would respond by saying this. We need to understand something about the complicated nature of people. If you were to look at one man and look at the way that his coworker described him in his life, that coworker would have one specific angle of the man. But then if you were to get the same kind of, if you were to ask the man's wife for her narrative of that man and his, what was fundamental and quintessential to his nature, the wife would be able to give you a different perspective, as would the man's sons, as would the man's close friends, as would his childhood siblings. Different people can offer a different perspective on the same man. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. What it reflects is people themselves are complicated. If regular people like you and I are so complicated that you could have overlaying pictures of the same person that are not in disagreement with each other, then certainly that could be true of Jesus as well. Given the varying degrees of education and backgrounds that these people came from, surely they were going to have different points of view on what they wanted to emphasize about Jesus, especially given that they wrote to different audiences. This doesn't mean that they contradict each other. What this simply means that Jesus was complicated just like you and I. He's not as simple as something that can be reduced down to a single word or a single sentence. People are never that simple. One of the next questions that tends to come about regarding the Gospels is whether or not we have the right Gospels. Now, people will raise questions about accounts such as the Gospel of Thomas, and they'll suggest, how do we know that the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, how do we know those are the right Gospels for us to have? Well, a couple distinctions that should be noted about these 4 that you can't say about every gospel, every so-called gospel narrative. Number one is that these 4 were written early and they were widely read. They were not just viewed by a small group of people, but these 4 were the most popular. They were passed around. They were widely believed by the early church. These were widely accepted. Number 2 is that these 4 were countercultural to the world that they were written to. A few simple examples would include the way that the Gospels are written against against a Gnostic culture. Now, the Gnostic ideas simply believed that all flesh, all things material, were evil. All things of the physical material world were inherently evil in every way, shape, and form, and evil just absolutely to their core. Now, certainly Christianity would teach that we have a naturally sin nature, that our flesh has a sin nature, but it wouldn't say that all flesh is inherently evil. Instead, the gospel narratives give a picture of resurrection back into the flesh, both by telling the story of Lazarus, where Jesus resurrects Lazarus back into his flesh, and when Jesus himself resurrects back into his flesh. This idea flies in the face of widely accepted Gnostic ideas in the first century Greco-Roman culture. To go a step further, the Gospels give a much more high and positive view of women than their culture would have given. The fact that, and this point will be touched on again later, the fact that the Gospels give women a place as the first to witness the resurrection, the first to witness the empty tomb, was an idea so preposterous to the people of their day that would have done nothing but hurt their credibility. There is no reason for the Gospels to go out of their way to be countercultural unless this is what they genuinely believed happened. To go a step further, some of these non-canonical accounts, such as the Gospel of Thomas, are not complete stories. They're simply a collection of sayings. And what you also see when you really study the Gospel of Thomas is that it doesn't reflect a countercultural idea, but rather the Gospel of Thomas paints a much more culturally conditioned view of Jesus that would have been much more acceptable to Romans, would have been much more acceptable to their culture. It doesn't make sense why the early church would pick these 4 specific Gospels unless they were absolutely convinced that this was the truth. There was no reason for them to single out only these 4. If anything, it would have made more sense for them to accept more and more accounts to further verify their story. If they believed these other accounts to be true as well, then they should have accepted as many as they could to further say, hey, see, we have not just 4 testimonies, we have 8, we have 12, 20, however many they wanted to say. But instead they limit themselves and say, no, there are 4 that we view as canonical. So then some will also raise the question of whether or not Jesus himself actually existed. This is actually a relatively simple one to address and dismiss. You can look at historians from that time period, from the first century world, people such as Josephus, as Tacitus, Pliny the Younger is another. Men who were not Christians, who had no reason to believe Jesus was the Son of God, and they said he wasn't the Son of God, but these men nonetheless said, yes, Jesus existed. They absolutely affirmed his existence. They made clear note to say, oh yes, he's that guy who was executed under Pontius Pilate. They make note of saying, oh yes, he was a teacher. Some say he was from Galilee, and yes, we know that he was killed, and then his followers say that he rose from the dead. Now these men had a negative view of Christians and of the Christian faith. They had no reason to record the existence of Jesus if they thought the whole religion was a sham. If they didn't believe any of it, if they thought Jesus didn't exist, they would have made that clear. They would have taken every chance they could have to say, this idea of Jesus being the Messiah is ridiculous because he didn't even exist. They would have said that if they believed it, but they didn't. Instead, they affirm Jesus existed. They just simply say they think Christians are crazy and that Jesus must have been nothing more than a teacher. Not to mention, there's more manuscripts that testify to the existence of Jesus than exist for other historical figures from the time. One such example would be Tiberius, the Roman emperor who would have reigned during Jesus' ministry. We have more manuscripts that testify to the life of Jesus than the life of Tiberius. There's no reason people ever question the life of Tiberius. People question the life of Jesus because effectively it gives them, they want to search for a reason to doubt the Bible, to doubt Christianity. But even most atheists, even most skeptic, agnostic scholars, even most of them will tell you, oh yes, we have definite proof that Jesus existed. So effectively this is a claim that does not ultimately hold water. So how about this claim, the idea that the Gospels were just written as legends? They weren't meant to be taken very literally. They're just fabricated tales. Well, there's several issues with the way that this also lines up with their culture. Number one is that these are too specific to line up with what legends looked like in their day. There are too many moments where the gospel writers make clear of a very specific location, a specific time, specific people who were caught up in the narrative. They make mention of specific details, such as Jesus being asleep and lying his head on a pillow underneath the boat. There are too many specific details for this to just be a legendary story. Instead, what we see is this much more reflects the way people would write history of their day, where people would write historical narratives. It's far too specific to be just another legend. Not to mention, it used specific nearby places and locations that people could visit. Legends of their day often spoke of perhaps far-off lands or spoke of very vague places. That's not what we see with the Gospels. The other issue is it's too early for these to be legends. The Gospels were primarily written in the first century, and what we see with that, what you can see with these four Gospels is if they were written in the first century, then what that would tell us is that this is too early for these to be fabricated legends because they testify to people, they tell of people's existence who would have still been alive, people who were recorded about in the Gospels. One such example would be Simon of Cyrene, who helped Jesus carry his cross. It is told that he was the father of Rufus and Alexander. There's no reason he would be cited unless he and his sons were meant to be cited as sources for a historical moment, not just a legend. And again, this kind of connects back to it's too specific, but there are people who are cited as eyewitnesses to the whole event who would have been alive when the Gospels were written. The letters of Paul attest to this as well when they talk about how there were roughly 500 people who Jesus appeared to after his resurrection. And Paul effectively says, look, if you don't believe me, talk to one of the 500 people who saw the risen Jesus. It's too early for this to just be a legend. They're also too counterproductive. There's no reason for the disciples to fabricate a story that's run so contrary to the culture of their day. There's no reason for them to make women the first people to witness the resurrection. There's no reason for them to give such an exalted view of resurrection, given the Gnostic influence of the day. There's no reason for Jesus to make statements in the Beatitudes where he teaches ideas such as blessed are the meek, the humble, the peacemakers, the poor in spirit. All of these ideas that Jesus said, these are the kinds of people who are truly blessed. That flew in the face of what people considered blessed in the first century Greco-Roman world. All of this flew in the face of their wisdom. So there's no reason for Jesus to just be a legend to the disciples, given how counterproductive the gospel narratives inherently were. And that then brings us to then touch on the last point. And this could tie into how counterproductive the gospels were. Being built on the notion of resurrection inherently makes your story harder to believe. Why would the disciples build their story on resurrection if they didn't believe it was true? To go a step further, the disciples clearly believed that Jesus rose from the dead. They believed a physical resurrection of the dead. And our evidence of this is not only did they preach that he rose from the dead, but when they were faced with horrendous persecution, they were faced with torture, and they were even faced with death, they willingly died for the belief that Jesus physically rose from the dead. Not some belief that he rose in their hearts, not some belief that he one day was going to rise again. No, they believed he physically rose again and that they witnessed his resurrection. There was no reason they would have willingly died otherwise. So in and of itself, this idea is the axe to any idea that would suggest, well, the disciples stole the body. There's no way they would have stolen the body and then willingly died for an idea that they knew was false. Plenty of people have died for an idea. Nobody dies for an idea that they know is false. If the disciples stole the body, they had no reason to give their lives for a lie. To continue, we then have to consider, what are the alternate options to the resurrection? What could have happened? Well, some people will suggest that the disciples or the women just stumbled across the wrong tomb. Well, there's several issues with this idea. Number one is that, well, they weren't looking for an open tomb, they were looking for a closed tomb. So if there was any doubt about which tomb Jesus was in, then they wouldn't have stopped at an open tomb. To take it a step further, if Jesus had, if they had found him in the wrong tomb, if they had found the wrong tomb open, again, Roman and Jewish authorities would have been able to say, no, Jesus is not risen, here's his body, you had the wrong tomb. But they didn't do that. And to go a step further, some of this comes back to how specific the gospel narratives are. They recount that Joseph of Arimathea is the man who donated the tomb Jesus was buried in. Again, this is further evidence that they viewed the resurrection as a historical event. There's no reason they would record Joseph of Arimathea being the man who gave him a tomb if they wanted any ambiguity about where Jesus was. They knew where he was, and they knew he wasn't there. So then what if Jesus didn't actually die on the cross? Well, medically speaking, this flies in the face of all of our understandings of what crucifixion was and on how Romans knew how to execute through crucifixion. There's no evidence of anybody ever surviving a crucifixion. There's no evidence of anybody even coming close. This was a brutal way to die, and it could take a long time, but it was still, there's every ounce of evidence we have about crucifixion shows that it ended in death. There's no person who survived a crucifixion. Not to mention, if Jesus simply passed out exhausted, there's still not an explanation for how it is he reappeared 3 days later and rolled the stone out of the way. You still have to explain how somebody moved this giant stone that would have taken 10 men to move in the first place. How does that get moved out of the way by Jesus himself? And again, not to mention that he was, even before the cross, he was whipped, beaten, and bleeding. There's no way he would have survived the crucifixion. So what if he genuinely did rise from the dead? What if he really is a man who was more than just a man? What if he genuinely was the Son of God? Well, if he truly rose from the dead, this demands a belief in God, and this demands a belief in the supernatural. It demands a belief in the possibility of miracles. There is so much historical evidence pointing towards people who believed in the resurrection, people who say, I was an eyewitness to the resurrection. There's so much historical evidence there that the only reason it's really doubted is because the idea of resurrection itself is so astonishing to us. It's not something we see every day. We don't see people just rise from the dead every single day. So it's hard for us to believe inherently. But if there is a God, then there's no reason that Jesus could not have raised from the dead. And there's no reason he couldn't be him. While the resurrection could be viewed as a shortcut to try and disprove Christianity, it is at the same time a shortcut to empower Christianity. Because if the resurrection is true, then we, yes, absolutely can trust everything in the Bible. Because if Jesus is truly raised from the dead, if he is truly resurrected, then that verifies so much Old Testament prophecy. It verifies that he was genuinely deity. It verifies that, yes, there is a supernatural. Yes, there is something greater than what we can understand. If Jesus truly is raised from the dead, then this event in and of itself proves that, yes, we can trust the Bible. And again, at the end of the day, we have, if one is to deny a belief in the resurrection, you still have to grapple with what are your alternative options. Every one of them ultimately falls short. Every one of them has some kind of logical hole. The only logical hole in resurrection is that you must then believe in a supernatural. You must believe effectively in God. So at the end of this, I would say unequivocally, yes, we can trust the Bible. Yes, we can trust the Gospels. Yes, we can trust resurrection. So that's all I have for this. I don't know if I was supposed to make a bibliography with this as well. I do have that if need be, so just let me know if that is something I need to turn in, and I'll send that in.